Hello, I'm Leah Holiday, and I'm going to be presenting to you my paper, Office at Night, an examination of male and female identity constructs of early 20th century America. The United States, between wars, was a country overwhelmed by its isolating modernity. The trauma of the Depression, combined with the atrocities of World War I, created a skeptical and pessimistic culture. Cultural rules and codes were evolving to express the transitioning post-war culture. One code to consider is that of traditional gender roles, male dominance versus female subordination. In a male-dominated society, women are suppressed. They are expected to remain at home, tend to the house, the children, and husband. Women's choices are limited and scripted by a chauvinist society. However, social changes were in transition after World War I. With more women holding jobs outside their domestic environment, both males and females had to reevaluate their evolving roles. In this paper, I will examine how the American realist artist Edward Hopper identified and portrayed the subtleties and complications of the transitioning gendered roles of males and females. I will define the specific roles of women and men within the historical context of post-World War I United States. Through this analysis, I will examine how and why Hopper subverted the expectations of the female figure in art. Through subtle attention to detail, he allowed his female figures an interiority that suggests their subjectivity. By engendering his female figures with a contemplative platform, Hopper underscores their boredom and their dysfunction. I will demonstrate how Hopper's sensitivity to their boredom and isolation is a manifestation of his own interior complexities. I argue that his sensitive rendering of the female figure as an isolated, disconnected entity is an expression of his own alienation from his father, from his wife, and from society. Office at Night immediately draws the viewer in with its quietly compelling scene. The image focuses on the interior of an ordinary office after hours. The mundane nature of the title is deceptive, for in reality, the painting accentuates an urban restlessness and isolation between the two figures, as well as between the figures and the viewer. The unusual, oblique, bird's-eye view perspective contributes to the tension. The tilting canvas appears unstable. The entire scene feels like it will slip right off the canvas. The cool tones contribute to an overall harsh, edgy quality of the painting. Both the cool tones and the voyeuristic perspective are reminiscent of Giorgio de Chirico's dreamlike landscape painting, The Mystery and the Melancholy of a Street. Both painters favored architectural structure to define an arena at once obviously human and oddly empty and haunting. Although Hopper's office is not devoid of humans, it communicates a dreamy, disconnected emptiness nonetheless. The feeling of isolation between the office workers themselves, as well as between the viewer and the subjects, is enhanced by the viewer's voyeuristic perspective. Hopper claims that the subject was inspired by the many rides he took on the L train in New York. He recreates the sensation that the viewer is passing by this office at night, peeking in, isolated from the figures inside. The viewer, as well as the figures inside, are all victims of the anonymity of modern urban disconnection. The recognition of this mutual isolation is what draws the viewer into a painting that would otherwise seem mundane and conventional. In Office at Night, the two figures, one male and one female, subtly communicate modern themes of isolation and alienation. Hopper continuously explored these themes in painting and drawing throughout his career. In his painting Automat, Hopper underscores the feelings of loneliness and isolation of a young female who sits alone at a table for two. Patricia Junker, in her book Edward Hopper's Women, observes, Hopper has presented a figure utterly alone and defenseless against our gaze. compelling us to consider more than a place and character type. He has given us form to the deep human need for social contact by suggesting the human tragedy that loneliness can portend. The young lady expresses the endemic feeling of the modern urban city. She quietly drinks a cup of coffee alone at night. Like the secretary from Office at Night, her eyes remain downcast. She does not invite our presence. She sits alone and remains alone in that space that was emphatically impersonal. Junker explains, these halls could be joyless and soulless places, the epitome of a city that moved so fast it offered little time or opportunity for meaningful human contact. In both the Automat and Office at Night, we are subjected to the disconnected loneliness of existence in modern urban America. As the voyeuristic audience, we view the female figure standing at a black filing cabinet. We can presume she is a secretary, as evidenced by a small desk with a typewriter in the foreground. As she rifles through the papers in the filing cabinet, she turns her upper body towards the other figure in the painting, a man who is seated at a desk. Her body contorts into an awkward contrapposto. We can see both the silhouette of her buxom bosom as well as her well-formed backside at the same time. This position, which mirrors the curving lines of the office chair to the left, is unnatural and is nearly physically impossible to replicate. By connecting her sensual body to the sensual curves of the chair, she becomes another utilitarian accessory for her boss. By accentuating her voluptuous female parts, Hopper emphasizes her sexuality, drawing our gaze towards her open torso and face. Her full red-colored lips, contrasting to her vibrant blue dress, further enhances her sensual nature as our gaze insists on resting there on her face. However, upon closer inspection, we realize that we are denied full access for two reasons. First, her lower torso remains positioned facing the file cabinet and away from our view. Second, she does not invite or reciprocate our gaze. She casts her attention not to us, but downwards, just to the side of the man's desk. Similar to the young woman in Automat, her expression is heavy and thoughtful, with a wistful, almost regretful look. Hopper hides her eyes in shadow, allowing her interior self to remain private. As a viewer, we are unable to penetrate her gaze. She remains isolated from the visual connection we seek and desire. A gentle wind breezes through the window, causing the shade cord to flutter. Hopper historian Gail Levin observes, and in the best pulp fiction matter, the melodramatic detail of the window shade luffing in the night air suggests imminence. A breeze can be a symbolic harbinger suggesting that something is about to occur. Hopper harkens back to this theme he employed earlier in his career with etchings like Evening Wind. In Evening Wind, the subject is a young female. The viewer glimpses her in a private moment as she kneels on her bed. Her nude body is remarkably vulnerable compared to the solid, sensual figure of the secretary in Office at Night. The young nude woman demonstratively reacts to the breeze. She turns her face and upper body towards the window. In contrast, the secretary avoids directing her attention to the window and averts her gaze downward. In Evening Wind, the breeze suggests something is imminent. It seems something is likely or probable to happen in this sexually charged moment. However, in Office at Night, what the breeze seems to indicate is the opposite. Rather than indicating that something will actually happen, the breeze seems to emphasize that the something will never materialize. The viewer, the secretary, and the boss will all remain isolated and alone. In Office at Night, the secretary's downcast eyes forces the viewer to follow her gaze and wonder what caught her attention. A piece of paper, the object of the secretary's attention, sits quietly on the floor, partially tucked under the man's desk. Perhaps it was purposely dropped by the secretary or indiscriminately blown there by the breeze. Hopper accentuates the ambiguity of the moment, allowing the viewer to formulate a unique narrative based on personal experience and fantasy. Adding to the narrative tension is the seemingly passive man seated at the desk. The man's introverted inaccessibility stands in direct contrast to the vivacious central secretary. While she turns her face to his direction, he remains completely indifferent to her activity, to the soft breeze, and to the paper on the floor. He faces his desk, concentrating on reading papers under a small brass banker's light. He refuses to be distracted. He is dressed in a dark brown three-piece suit, while she, in a dramatic contrast, fills out the tight, form-fitting blue dress. The suggestion of the breeze accentuates the tension by causing her dress to cling to her sensual figure. The dress is the only blue in the room. She stands out amongst the drab greens and browns of the office. However, the man still manages to ignore her. The male, most likely her boss, seems dull and diminutive compared to her larger-than-life physique and sexuality. One interpretation of the man's detached countenance is that his morally encoded self-control and inward contemplation prevents him from engaging. By ignoring his secretary, he maintains his code of honor and his ties to the morals that surround marriage and sex. In her book Art and the Crisis of Marriage, Edward Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe, Vivian Greed Fried writes, "The man, on the other hand, wears an appropriately sober jacket, tie, and shirt, evoking a dignity, self-control, and a commanding presence. He exudes control over himself and the workspace. However, I would like to offer a different interpretation in light of Hopper's own History of Family Dynamics. Biographer Gail Levine examines the male and female role models of Edward's mother and father. She explains, if ideas of male superiority were in the air, they could hardly be taken for granted in the Hopper menage. Edward's father was not in charge, leaving his son alone in a household in which he was overwhelmed by females, his mother, his sister, his grandmother, and the maid. Hopper himself has stated that the primary purpose of his paintings is to provide a vehicle for self-expression. Boldly stated, he said, art is one's effort to communicate to others one's emotional reaction to life and the world." If the viewer relies on a cursory interpretation of Hopper's females, the secretary may become an object of the male gaze. She exudes voluptuous sexuality with a striking physique emphasized by her suggestive, form-fitting dress. This interpretation is limited and lacks validity, considering the intense, brooding nature of Hopper as well as the place and time this work was painted. Art historian Elliot Bothwick Davis describes Hopper's character. She says, in reality, he passed through the art world capital, Paris, with the reserve typical of his personality, his Anglo-Saxon heritage, and, as time would show, his painting. Although we view the secretary's sultry body from above as a voyeur, consuming her body and intruding on her privacy, what separates her position from that of a more predatory male-dominated gaze is the communication of societies, including Hopper's own, isolation and dissatisfaction.